Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Heather. I'm so excited to be here. This is my first Facebook Live, so it's kind of exciting. So a little bit about me, for those of you who may have seen my name, know a little bit about me. One thing you may not know is that I was an Army brat, come from a long line of military members in my family. So when I was younger, one of the questions that I really hated getting was, "Where are you from?" Because that was always tricky for me. Born in North Carolina, couldn't tell you a darn thing about North Carolina. But I spent most of my time as a teenager in El Paso, Texas. So before moving to Austin to attend the University of Texas at Austin to study civil engineering, go Horns. Uh,
Go
I,
civil engineers. That's my
yeah,
degree
go
too.
civil engineer. Yeah. I would say I was from El Paso, but now I've been in Austin for so many years. This is where I work. I work remotely for SWE out of Austin. So Austin is home.
Awesome. Well, it's great to know a little bit more about you. And I think that some folks may be surprised to realize that you are also an engineer. So it's awesome to have you in the Sweet family.
Yeah, I'm excited to work for the Society of Women Engineers in this capacity because I really feel that it just blends a lot of my education and experience together. The engineering background, as well as my work in education policy and research, coming together to study equity in STEM. It's very exciting.
Absolutely. So, speaking of research, many of our members participated in the COVID-19 surveys that you conducted last year. What are a couple of things that jumped out at you when you were looking over the responses from those surveys?
Yeah, well, we conducted a few surveys last year. The first one in the May-June timeframe. You all remember that everything pretty much shut down in March, and probably a lot of us were like me, and we were very optimistic about how long, that it wouldn't last very long. Well, by May, we realized that this could last a while, and so we issued our first survey to our membership at large, and we received about 1,700 responses to that survey. We were really interested in understanding what the impact of COVID-19 was on engineers because we had been seeing a lot in the news about the economic impact on women, its unequal impact on women in general, because they tend to, there are a lot of women who work in like the service industry or the education field. Daycares were closing, schools were closing. So there was a lot happening that was negatively impacting women. But it was unclear what the impact was on engineers and women in STEM. So this first survey was really to try and get just a basic understanding. And one of the things that was sort of, I guess, it depends on how you look at it, surprising to me, maybe not so much when you think about the highly educated workforce that we're talking about, but job losses were not really prevalent among women in engineering. What they were experiencing were really around cuts in salary, cuts in benefits, hiring freezes, cuts in professional development. So there was a lot happening within their workplaces. A lot of them were able to work remotely, not everyone, but a lot of them were able to make that transition. But they were talking a lot about and sharing a lot about their care burdens, which is something that we had been reading about across the around the globe. Women were experiencing higher levels of um, childcare responsibilities, household responsibilities, taking on a lot of that educational support for their children, taking on a lot of the adult care for their parents and for others within their families, that for the most part during COVID had really been among the most vulnerable populations when it came to this virus. So there was a lot of responsibility placed on women. But one of the things that we have to remember is that the survey was asking for feedback from engineers from their perspective. So some of the questions that we asked were around like what were your what were your employers doing? What was the response to this pandemic? And were you satisfied with that response? 3 out of 4 engineers said they were satisfied with how their employers had responded to the pandemic and how they were sort of making adjustments to accommodate their employees and the security or the safety measures that were put in place for those employees who did have to go to the workplace. Over 90% of the engineers in our survey expressed satisfaction with a level of communication that they were receiving from their employers, which I think is pretty impressive. This was a really difficult time for a lot of organizations, and that level of communication, if we could see that across the board in all different areas, we would see so much change, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I wanted to talk about, I want to go back to that work-family balance, because um, even though we had high levels of satisfaction around work-family balance, I'd say like 70% of engineers in our survey said that they were relatively satisfied with our work-family balance. We saw differences based on industry. So women in academia, like that field, and women in the military weren't as satisfied. And so, women in academia, think of faculty, think of the graduate students that are having to work as research assistants, teaching assistants, and that pivot to that virtual environment must have been just really difficult. Based on age, women who were younger were also less satisfied with their work-family balance. A lot of students participated in our survey. So think about the students who had to take those online classes, and in engineering, a lot of hands-on labs that are required that just, maybe they're making the decision to push those off to another semester. The impact on their graduation, the impact on their ability to find internship opportunities and job opportunities. There was just a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot of concern about when they were going to graduate, were they going to be able to find a job. One of our second survey was conducted in September, and that was among women, actually engineers, men and women in India. And we were seeing the same levels of concern among students, among engineers, regardless of gender, though women were expressing higher levels of heavier care burdens and lower levels of satisfaction. So definitely something that we were seeing globally.
Absolutely. It's been something that I know that I've been talking about with my sweet colleagues about, especially recently, kind of coming up on the anniversary and hitting the pandemic wall. There's been a lot about that, and us talking about needing to let ourselves off the hook a little
Yeah,
bit, because some of those pressures are self-driven, some of them aren't. But what can we let go of and recognize that maybe success right now is just making it through the day, right?
absolutely. That is so true. I think one of the drawbacks of the survey that we initially conducted in May of last year is that it was one of the first, I guess, that was sort of going out, and we always tried to make our surveys manageable. We don't want to ask you to spend an hour answering questions about what's going on in your life. So when we sent out this survey and we received the responses back, it's like for every question we asked and we looked at the response, 5 more questions came up. So it's, it's trying to balance that level of expectation, I guess, as to what we can actually learn from this, and what can we do moving forward to really help support women engineers and women in STEM.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I mean, unfortunately, we're still dealing with this pandemic and things have not returned to the way they were pre-COVID, and we don't know if they ever will. What plans do you have to continue your COVID research? Those extra questions that have come up. What's next?
Yes. Yeah. We're coming on a year now. I can't believe that. It's been a
Yeah.
year that we've
Yep.
been dealing with this. So we are planning to issue another survey in May, June. So it will be pretty much to the year, to the, year to the day that we issued that first survey. So we're going to follow up on that and see what's changed, do some comparison contrast, ask some similar questions, but as you said, it gives us the opportunity to add a few more. For example, one that I think I've been getting a lot of is, sure, women maybe not, maybe are not losing their jobs, but maybe they are self-selecting to leave, or maybe they are self-selecting to reduce their hours. So I think that those are questions that we have the opportunity to explore a bit more in this follow-up survey. We're also getting some questions about company response, because when this pandemic hit, there were a lot of sort of, I guess, policies that had to be sort of changed, um,
Or invented.
or invented around, remote work and allowing for flexible scheduling. How much of that is going to stay in place? What are companies going to be doing now that things are starting to get back to quote normal, where people can start going back to the workplace? So we're going to be exploring that a bit more as well.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really critical because I know from some of SWE's past research that flexibility is something that women are really seeking in their employment even before all of this happened.
Yeah, it's interesting. In that very first survey that we did, I remember one comment standing out, because the way we had phrased one of the questions was, is your employer allowing you to work remotely? And is that sort of like a benefit that you're seeing? And one of the women was like, well, yes, but it's not like they are like allowing, they're how can I phrase this? It was like they were being, the way I had phrased it was like, are you, is this a positive development? Whereas some women were saying, this is not exactly a positive thing for me. I would much prefer to work in the office. So you phrasing it, like me phrasing it that way, is sort of making an assumption that this is what all women want. So sometimes it kind of makes you kind of step back as somebody who's writing up these survey questions, and think about how you're asking these questions, because I mean, you're right. Not everyone, it is a benefit for a lot of women, and a lot of women appreciate that. A lot of engineers, men and women, appreciate that flexibility. But not everyone wants to be sort of forced, I guess, where the expectation is that because you have that flexibility, because you now are able to work remotely and have that access 24/7 through your laptop, through your mobile, that is the ideal.
Yeah, then it starts to bleed everywhere and people aren't stopping working. It's totally true.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, well, I know a lot of this research is covered in the upcoming State of Women Engineering SWE magazine issue, which is coming up next month. So, what else can we expect to see in that issue?
I am so excited about this issue. It is our fifth one, focused on research. And this year, unsurprising, the focus is on COVID. Um, we've got three articles that are focused on this. The first one, of course, being the one on our own research, but we've also got our main article written by Sandra Guy, who is looking at sort of taking a more robust view, looking at the McKinsey and Company's Women in the Workplace report, which was released, I think it's their sixth one, and they were focused on the impact of COVID, looking at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's consensus report on the impact on women in academia, looking at talking with a researcher from the US Census Bureau to look at the impact on women with children. So it's really a very like global in the sense that it's like women across the workforce look at the impact. And we've also got an article that's a bit more like positive look at STEM outreach during this time, because it has been challenging to try and reach girls and get them interested in STEM. But it's also introduced some opportunities, because as SWE and other organizations have found, through this remote environment, we're able to reach a lot of girls who would not be able to attend some of our in-person events because of location and geography, transportation, those kinds of issues. So it's been exciting to see some of that. We've got our annual literature review. It's our 19th year of sharing relevant research on women in STEM. And then we've also got some policy updates. There's a lot happening under the Biden administration, a lot that's happened over the course of the last year as we've gone from the Trump administration into the Biden administration around Title IX, around diversity training. So it's really a timely issue. It will help women who are going to be doing or participating in the Capitol Hill events, the virtual events that we'll be hosting next year. Next
month.
month.
We'll do it next year also,
Next
but
year.
this one is timely for this year's visits. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
right.
Yeah, I love this State of Women in Engineering issue. There's just so much great information that goes in there. Besides that issue, where else can people learn more about the research that SWE is conducting?
I always point people to our SWE research site, research.swe.org. We have a lot of data and statistics out there. We have our reports out there, our conference papers on our researchers out there. The past annual literature reviews are out there as well. Of course, the magazine, every issue of that magazine, we have links to that on our SWE research site. I've got a podcast that I did with Ann Perusik, our director of publications. That should be available next week, I believe, around the State of Women in Engineering issue. So you can find out more about the contents on that podcast. And then, of course, please plan to attend our annual State of Women in Engineering session at the conference each year.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite sessions too. Thanks again, Roberta. Obviously, the State of Women in Engineering magazine issue being focused on research over the last 5 years is not a coincidence. That's how long Roberta has been with our organization. So we love that we can highlight her work in that issue. And remember, everybody, you can check out everything that SWE is doing, all of that great research that Roberta and her team work on, research.swe.org. Thanks again, Roberta. It was great chatting with you today, and we'll be answering questions that come up in the chat on Facebook after this event.
Thanks, Heather.